So let's move on. We're now in chapter 5, anticipations. I just wanted to make a note on chapter 4. So we're still in Walzer's book, and we're in part 2, the theory of aggression, starting chapter 5. But remember, something from chapter 4 is important here because chapter 5 talks about anticipations, right? Kind of as I label here, just provisionally, kind of the idea of, get them before they get you. Right. So what do you do, and what do you do regarding the notion of a neighbor who might be hostile or building up forces? How does that figure into thinking about the ethics of war? Okay. And we'll return to this little get them before they get you kind of thing. Now recall in chapter 4, so think about chapter 4, the theory of aggression first takes shape in what Walzer called the legalist paradigm. And there were 6 propositions, if you recall, and there was proposition number 3, right? So there's 6 of them. I'm not going to go back over them. Go check out their previous video, and of course check out the book to go through them. But proposition 3 in the legalist paradigm, remember, first takes shape as the legalist paradigm. So he's going to modify this as he goes along. So the book, again, is an extended discussion and argument. So don't just read the first parts and think you got the whole position, because he develops it. And basically, as we'd say today, he's tweaking it as he goes along. So number 3, any use of force or imminent threat of force by one state against the political sovereignty or territorial integrity of another constitutes aggression and is a criminal act. So what he's concentrating on here is that second kind of force, not the use of force, but the imminent threat of force. What's that all about? Well, historically, as Walzer points out, and any amateur student of history will notice that lots of wars, they are started by one side claiming that kind of along these lines, well, the enemy is maybe not doing it all that much right now, but I know they're preparing. So, if I want to have peace, I got to prepare for war because my enemies probably are all kind of against me. So that's what Walzer's looking at here now. When can you talk about starting a war? Well, he starts by saying, let's look at this proposition, this idea of a preemptive strike. So check this out. X could legitimately launch an unconstrained preemptive strike on Y. So so there hasn't been actual hostilities, like there's no battle or fighting actually going on. We're talking about X launching an unconstrained preemptive strike on Y, provided that it can be shown that X will immediately suffer an overwhelming attack by Y. Kind of like X is going to get Y before Y gets X, right? Because this is the idea that X is like, I'm going to knock out or take out something about Y because I know Y is ready to launch some kind of overwhelming attack. Okay. Walzer says that this is not the case, that it never happens or it never is something that could be argued for, but it's pretty artificial. Because, why? Because it's usually the case, because usually X has the time to deliberate, right, and think about what Y is up to, rather than this rush, like we got to do something immediately or we're doomed. Usually has time to deliberate, but not always. So he thinks, let's think of this kind of on a continuum, right? Reality is often like that. There's certain kinds of cases, and you have your kind of maybe your extreme versions of things, and then you have stuff kind of in the middle. And what do we have here? Well, sure, there's no time. Act now. Well, then X launches its preemptive war, but we have to take into account that that's not always the case. So if we think of this as an extreme where like there's no time to deliberate, and then we think of a continuum as like increasing time to deliberate, well, you might still come to the same conclusion that you have to do something. But in that case, it's more like along this continuum, which is kind of illustrated by these little dots, where now we're talking about like a preventative war. Rather than a preemptive, we're talking about preventative wars that, yeah, we thought about it, says X, we were looking at Y, and we're looking at all this stuff, and it's not a matter of, oh, we got to do it because it's imminent or whatever. But yes, we have to take action soon within a reasonable amount of time because there's going to be catastrophic consequences for us if we do not act soon. All right, so in that sense, is it okay to do that? Is it okay to launch not so much a preemptive, but a preventative war where you thought about it and you make the case? Well, let's look at this. Think about preventative wars. Why? And of course, remember, this is Walzer's moral argument with historical illustrations. What's the case? What does history say about this kind of warfare? That is preventative wars. Why are they typically started? Well, one view is that people have typically held a balance of power view, BOP or BOP. So preventative wars, why are they typically started? They're to preserve this balance of power, right? Now, think about a balance of power, right? What is it? Well, just as the imagery comes to mind, right? Like a balance scale. You have powers and powers, and if you want everything to keep in a kind of equilibrium, if one side gains a little bit more power and it's going to tip it in that favor, the other guy's got to do something, right? So there's always this dynamic possibility that when power starts to shift, somebody better do something, because if it keeps shifting, right, the whole thing's going to collapse in favor of one person or one state in this case. But think about it. This balance of power argument or this balance of power idea or interpretation. Remember, it's an interpretation. It's not just simply a fact. It is an interpretation. So we look back at history and we ask, what do the documents, what did people say, why they were doing things? And it seems that they had this kind of explanation. Now, historically, sure, that's probably the case that they did. But was that the right thing for them to always be doing? And of course, is it the right thing for us to be looking at, just sheer balance of power arguments? Yeah, we should continue and always interpret the world like that. That's a question for us today. So the historical record may tell us one thing, but that doesn't mean we're bound to it. It's not some sort of historical determinism just because people in the 16th and 17th centuries, let's say you could establish it, which always is debatable, but let's say you could establish beyond a reasonable doubt, like absolutely, oh yeah, that's how they saw the world and that's what they did. That doesn't mean that they were right about even their own world, right? And it certainly doesn't mean that we have to do that today. So you can counter these balance of power arguments, even if it's historically true that that's what people did. There's no reason why we have to do it. Okay, but because it's an interpretation, let's dig in. What does it presuppose? Well, basically, balance of power the balance of power viewpoint really presupposes that everybody in the system, this is sort of a notion from international relations theory, sometimes, and this is basically a realist position, is that the balance of power argument is basically a realist position that says something like, well, the international system is anarchic, right? Because there's no large overseer, as Hobbes would say. They're all just gladiators looking at each other, and one gladiator gets a bit of a bigger weapon or something that tips the balance. Gladiators are not predisposed to be nice to each other. They're predisposed to kill each other because everybody in this system, you presuppose, has nasty intentions, right? So all your neighbors or everybody in the system that you're talking about, all the states, really, they don't want to be friends with other states. They want to take them over. They have hostile intentions, right? There's hostility right in the system. That's just the way it is, right? So balance of power says that, well, anybody who gets a little bit bigger of a weapon over here or more gunpowder or whatever, right? Couple that with bad intentions. So the whole system is replete with bad actors. All right, and so the first, okay, now notice I put a little gamma here. So I've got a little asterisk and a gamma. I'll come back to those, why I've got those there in a second. So the first level utilitarian argument, basically the initial sort of utilitarian argument would go something like this. And before I get into that, remember, utilitarianism roughly is looking at consequences. It's not necessarily a cost benefit, which is more like what's going on here, but it really is looking at consequences. So I put utilitarian in quotation marks here. I don't think it was the best word for Walzer to use, but hey, he can use basically what words he wants, but this is more like just a straightforward kind of consequential argument more than a utilitarian one. But anyways, that quibble aside, the first sort of the first, at first blush, prima facie, you'd say something like this. Well, look, if you lose the balance of power, right, somebody's going to dominate. That's the system. Right? If the balance of power is not preserved, eventually you're going to get a monopoly of power, right? If the powers that are competing, somebody's going to win, right? So somebody eventually, right? In the long run, you're looking at trouble. Someone's going to run the show. So in order to avoid that, you better get in there and fight early before, if right now you fight because there's an imbalance of power, fight early, fight now in order to stop that small imbalance from growing into a bigger one, and then the whole system, and then you get maybe a hegemon out of the deal, right? You get, oh no, like there's a bunch of states kind of competing and jostling, and the balance of power is like this, but then if one of them starts to get too powerful, it's going to tip the whole system, and then bang, you got a hegemon, you have something that's running the whole show, and this whole thing collapses, and well, if you're the state that's emerging, well, as the hegemon, great for you, but it's pretty lousy for everyone else. So everyone is going to be thinking along these lines. Now, okay, you can run that argument, but it's, again, it is an argument. It can be challenged, and it's got its presuppositions, right? And it's kind of got this get them before they get you presupposition that I've with the asterisks. And it's also got this one, that everything is just underwritten. The whole system is underwritten by malign intentions, right? That's all states really have. Again, it's not an argument to say that the states are gladiators. It's an analogy, right? So we can reject it. Even in history, if they all thought along those Hobbesian lines that states were just like gladiators, that doesn't mean that Hobbes, dare I say it, doesn't mean Hobbes was right. And it doesn't mean that Hobbes can't be questioned. In other words, it doesn't mean that we have to just accept this. So Walzer then says, well, let's take a second level utilitarian argument, which counters this, and says something like, embracing these principles or these ideas, 1 and 2, it's going to have very, very dangerous consequences. Think about this one here. That every time what does it say? Every time a balance is disrupted and an imbalance starts to occur, right? It always says that, well, every time, look out, because, and it says this as a general principle. It's an induction, right? Every time if you get a little imbalance, you're going to get another one, you're going to get another one, and every time a little imbalance is always going to lead to the overturning of the system. Is that true? Right? Does that always follow? Do imbalances always lead completely to the overturning of the system? And you can question that, which Walzer says that it could either, like to say it's, or you say it's perfectly static. So it's either static or it's catastrophic. That seems to be, pretty much setting up a binary, right, in this, where you think, no, actually it could be kind of a continuum. Maybe you can have slight imbalances in the system and it'll wobble like this, but that doesn't mean it's going to flip immediately. And it doesn't have to mean that either it's this or flipping completely. Well, maybe it can do this over time. Fine, right? That's not catastrophic. So in that sense, but if you always treat an imbalance as a potential catastrophe or a catastrophe, the thin edge of the catastrophe is here because there's an imbalance, and then bang, you're off to war, and then everybody's launching preventative wars, you're going to get more wars than even are justified on preserving the balance of power, because you're just overreacting. In other words, you're kind of a little paranoid that every act of that produces an imbalance is necessarily going to continue on and upset the whole system. All right, so this makes everything, actually, the interest, this kind of produces, the exact opposite. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. The road to stability, it could be, the road to instability could be paved with all kinds of intentions to keep it stable, right? That's pretty clumsy, but I guess you get the picture. So you could be trying to preserve this stability with this thinking here of, oh, I'm going to always try to correct every little imbalance by war, and you could end up making things much more violent and much worse. And in the end, everybody's trying to preserve this stability, and you get just overwhelming instability, way more wars that are even justifiable on this balance of power. So there is sometimes, people say, a paradox under this whole thing, where it's supposed to lead to stability, and it could lead to the exact opposite. It could increase the levels of anarchy by presupposing some level that you can control, but it'll just make things worse, and it'll spiral out of control. Now, is it really morally prudent, right? Think about it in your own life, and what do we say to people that are saying that everyone is, hostile? I'm just surrounded by hostile people all the time. Now, of course, that could entirely be possible, but often we say things like, I think you're kind of being a little paranoid. So is this sort of state paranoia? Walzer is implying that, yeah, basically it is a kind of state paranoia, where you say not only is it, but maybe, you should be, as a state, you should be kind of paranoid because everybody's got malign, nasty intentions, right? So what do you do about this, right? Well, you challenge the presupposition. In that sense, we want to think about when, so this presupposition of fear, the negative intentions of others, this is all debatable. So when is it, though? You don't want to say that it's never prudent to be fearful of neighbors, or you don't want to take the opposite line and say, well, we go from saying everyone is hostile to then just say, absolutely, it is not the case that that anyone is hostile. Some, right? You go the middle way. Yeah, sure, some could be, and some not. So in some cases, you could say you have a just fear, right? A justified fear or a justified concern. So what is it then now to say that one state can have a just fear, a justified fear of another state, and therefore their fear is justifiable, however you want to unpack that, and that it would lead to, yeah, your fear is really justified, and you're kind of getting into this territory where you can say, in that case, then it would be legitimate. Now, so what we've done here, what this second level utilitarian argument, by challenging the presuppositions that are built into here, says something like this: you might get better consequences if you don't have this sort of just this complete fear and thinking that everyone has negative intentions. And remember that when X says of Y, state X says Y's behavior is hostile, that's not a fact, right? Because sometimes Y's behavior may look hostile, but it isn't. Think about the old, the old problem of other minds in philosophy. How do you really know? I mean, as we would say in just plain old ordinary language, how do you really know what people are thinking? Sometimes we look at people around us and think they're doing hostile things, and they have maybe no intention of ever doing anything negative to us. All right, so, okay, take that from the key of the individual and transpose it into the key of international relations. Not everything that states do that other states call hostile is necessarily hostile. It might be, though. It might be, though. I'm not saying it never is. The thing is to say that in this particular instance, that the augmenting of power by one state is not equivalent to hostility. So states may build up their power for a variety of reasons, not necessarily that they're going to attack, right? So does history ever show states building up power and they didn't use it to attack, or they didn't use it in ways that other countries claimed, right? They might have used it in different operations, or maybe attacking different things, but maybe not what one country may have claimed, oh, well, that state built up its power to attack me. Can you find examples where that never happened, where the state built up power, but it didn't attack a particular state that claimed it was under threat? So the main thing is not to completely separate the notion of the augmenting of power from threatening other states or, endangering other states. That's not what Walzer's trying to do. What he's just trying to do is break this equivalency of simply augmenting power is the same thing as hostility, which undermines the whole balance of power interpretation of international relations, because the whole balance of power thing always presupposes that the anarchic system is going to produce a hegemon if you interpret augmenting of power in any other way than hostility. That's why states increase their power, is because ultimately they're trying to take over the show, or maybe it's a reaction to someone else trying to take over. But power is always ultimately connected to some kind of destabilizing of the international society, right? And Walzer's saying that you don't have to buy into that, right? That is a particular interpretation, and we can challenge it. So the question is not to get rid of all these things, but to look more closely at, if we sever hostility from simply being unpacked, right, and operationalized. Oh, hostility to me is operationalized by what the behavior is of that other state. That's very easy, right? Because I can say hostility. Oh, I just identify it with the augmentation of power around me. That's easy. But if we sever that, then we have to ask the question, what is hostility really? What does it mean to say that one state is being hostile to its neighbors? How do we unpack, this notion of hostility, so that we can really, ultimately what we're trying to do is unpack the notion of a just fear. So you have this just fear, which can then fit the situation onto this continuum, may not be here, but it can then say, well, look, we have a just fear that Y is going to do something, so then we can launch our preventative war. So in the next video, we'll take a quick look at what this concept of a just fear might be. Stay tuned.